In this video, we're going to use supply and demand analysis to analyze the effects of a trade embargo. And in particular, what we're going to look at here is, and we're going to look at two different scenarios, but we're going to be looking at an example of where the embargoing countries are basically saying they're going to not allow for any exports to the embargoed country. Okay, so this is a trade embargo of exports. And in the book, they use the example of Iran, which is very timely given what's been happening with Iran, right? The U.S. pushing for more trade sanctions against that country. So, again, this is another great example of something we're doing in class that has real-world applications that is actually happening right now. So the question is, how can we use economic analysis to try to understand what might be the effects of this policy that's being pushed by the current administration? We also might want to think about why other countries may not want to be involved, and you have to think about what role those countries play. So right now, with the current scenario that we have with Iran, many of the European countries are hesitant to participate in that. Now, that is also a different scenario because partially what we're looking at there is it's an embargo on exports from out of Iran, right? In particular, oil exports. So here we're going to look at some examples of an embargo on imports to the embargoed country. And what I want you to do, I want you to think about how we would take the analysis that we're doing here and apply it to a scenario where instead of having it be the embargo on imports to the embargoed country, have it be an embargo on exports from Iran. Okay? So here we're going to do we're going to do an embargo on exports to Iran, or Iranian imports, but we want to consider the flip side as well. So here we have the Iranian market for whatever kind of whatever the embargoed goods are. Right? We're not allowed to sell these goods to Iran, or at least the embargoing countries don't want to. Here is the supply of these goods. Okay, and again, to make it really easy, just to assume there's no domestic supply in Iran for these particular goods. It just makes it much easier to analyze. So here is the supply. This is SN for the supply from the non-embargoing countries. And this is the demand for imports from Iran. And again, it just makes it a lot easier if we don't have to think about Iranian domestic production, so then we don't have to go back and draw the domestic market for Iran and track the changes in producer surplus. Right? Just let's keep it really straightforward and simple here. Now, what we have to add in, so this is just the supply from the non-embargoing countries. Now we also need to add into here the supply from the embargoing countries. So that's SN plus SE, supply from the non-embargoing and the embargoing countries. And this is actually, if you look at it, this price here, that is that would really be the price where the domestic autarky price for the embargoing countries in these markets. Okay, so that's where their supply curve starts. So without the embargo, our equilibrium would be here. Okay, and we'll label that Q0 following the book, and the price here would be P0. Okay. Now, with a complete embargo from the embargoing countries, what we're doing is we're getting rid of this additional supply. So we're saying, in effect, then, the supply of these goods to Iran is only given by the non-embargoed countries, right? The non-embargoing countries. So that puts us up here. Okay? So there will be fewer imports and a higher price. And so it should be pretty easy to see here that Iran's going to be worse off. And again, it makes it a lot easier if we're not worrying about domestic production. So what we have is, following the book, we're going to label these areas. So we'll call A is all of this here, right? This triangle. And then B is the area here to the left of SN. And then C is this triangle in here, right? So this dotted line is in the middle or kind of inside this area. So what is the change? What's the effect for Iran? Well, Iran's losing B and C in terms of consumer surplus, right? The price is going up, and they're going to import less. So those losses to Iran are in the form of lost consumer surplus. What about what's going on here? What about the U.S.? Well, we can see here is this area A. That area there is the loss to, and so let's say the embargoing countries is the U.S., right? The loss to the U.S., the embargoing country, is A. Okay? And why is that? Well, because here's, if you look at it, the supply that we're adding in with the U.S. curve, right, is that difference between really these two supply curves up to a price of P0. And so right here's your marginal cost, lower marginal cost curve. The U.S. producers would be willing to supply at these, right, at any of these quantities out here at prices below P0. So that's what they would have had in producer surplus without the embargo in place, is A. What about the non-embargoing countries? Right, so the other countries, they end up with a higher price, right? And so they end up where instead of a price of P0, they go up to P1. So, and again, here's their supply curve, right? Here's the SN. And so they would have produced at that lower price, right, this much of what was there before. Now they're only going to produce, right, now they're going to actually produce more up to Q1 at that higher price, so they're going to gain B. Okay. So globally, right, you actually have losses of A and C. And so the embargoing country, right, the U.S. loses out. And of course, the embargoed country, Iran, loses out. But the other countries that sell to Iran end up winning, right? So not everybody's necessarily going to be against the embargo. Interestingly enough, it's going to depend on where you line up, right? So if we're trying to understand politically, where countries sit, we have to understand, do they stand to gain or lose from the embargo? Right? So other countries are going to not necessarily want to join the embargo, right? They would rather be able to continue selling goods to Iran at a lower price. Okay? So they might be very happy to have the U.S. go ahead and put the embargo in place, knowing that they'll be better off. Now, in this case, if you look at it, right, A is relatively small compared to B and C, right? We can impose a lot of damage to the Iranian economy, right? A lot of loss of surplus for a relatively smaller loss of our own surplus. Okay? So that might be a feasible embargo, one that might ultimately have some success. However, embargoes very frequently fail. They fail either because economically they're not successful, or they're not successful politically. And we'll touch more on political failure of embargoes in class. But here I do want to illustrate an example where a trade embargo is not successful for economic reasons. Okay. And so in this case, what we have, so here's our note. We're going to draw here a more elastic demand for imports for Iran. Okay, so notice if you compare it to the demand curve we had here, it's much flatter, right? Meaning that the demand for imports in these embargoed goods from Iran is much more elastic than in the scenario on the left. And now what we're also going to draw here, so I'm going to have our supply curve, right, from the non-embargoing countries. And here we're going to have our supply curve from the embargoing countries, or we're adding in the embargoing countries. Right, so this is the supply from all sources. And so initially what we should have, again, if you go back, right, here's our P0, and Q0. But then when you put the embargo in place, we're going to have this higher price and a much lower quantity. Well, now where's B and C? B and C are given by these two areas here. And A is actually given by all of this here. Might help to see if I shade it in for you. Right? Again, right, because you're looking at the difference, right? The difference between the two supply curves, that is the supply of the U.S., right, the embargoing countries. So the area above the, right, it's that difference there and up to the price that they would have received. So the loss to the U.S., that A here, is much, much larger, right, than the loss to Iran. So this is a case where the embargo is actually inflicting much more economic damage on the country imposing the embargo than on the country that is having the embargo put into place against it. Okay? So this is one example of an economic reason why the embargo might fail. And if you look at it, we have to start to ask, well, what are the underlying factors, right? If you look at it, we're saying, well, one factor is, how elastic is the demand for imports in the embargoed country, in this case in Iran. Another question we have to ask is, well, how big of the supply is the U.S. in this example, right? The embargoing country. How much of the supply of these goods does the U.S. constitute, right? Can Iran get these goods elsewhere at competitive prices? And if so, the embargo is not going to be very effective from an economic standpoint. Again, in class, what I want us to really think about are a couple other factors, including what if we look at, instead of an embargo on exports to that country, what about exports from that country? And the other thing we want to think about is the political failure of embargoes even when they are economically successful.